Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Evelyn Chavez, the events producer here at CalMatters, and I appreciate you all joining us for this conversation. If you're not familiar with CalMatters, we are a nonprofit news organization covering California. We write stories on a lot of different issues, and we try to share reporting as much as we can with the California public. But there is something really special about getting a conversation together like this with people who are involved and understand the issue and who can ultimately really help us understand. This is what we in CalMatters describe as live journalism. So again, we're all really happy to have you all here. In an effort to minimize the disruption during the discussion, we will take questions via a Google form. I will share that link in the chat briefly, and I encourage you all to just submit your questions here. About 15 minutes from the end, we will take questions from that submission. Again, with just the large amount of people that are here in attendance, it's possible we might not get to every single question that you've asked, but I still encourage you to input it there. And with that, I will shift this over to Rachel so she can get us started.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Evelyn. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Becker, and I'm excited to welcome you all to a conversation about a major water supply in the state that we can't actually see, and that's the water tucked away in aquifers beneath the ground, or groundwater. Now, to contextualize just how vital groundwater is to California, in a good year, it makes up about 40% of the state's water supply. In a bad one, it's closer to 60. For millions of people, it's their only water source. And for California's farmers, who use about 80% of the state's groundwater, it's hugely important, especially when surface water supplies dry up. But it's also in trouble. It's been drained so much in some areas for irrigating farms that the earth has collapsed, and communities struggle with well outages and water contamination. So 10 years ago, as drought and dry wells spread across the Central Valley, lawmakers enacted the legislation that became the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, which will become an abbreviation that you'll hear a lot today. So now we're 10 years in. We've reached a pivotal moment in the law. And for the first time in California history, officials have taken steps towards cracking down on groundwater depletion in the state's agricultural heartland. So today we'll take a look back at the conditions 10 years ago that prompted California lawmakers to try to rein in overpumping. We'll look at the present and see what has changed for communities and for farms. And we'll look to the future and how both groundwater depletion and regulation will hit California and its agriculture. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Joaquin Esquivel, chair of the State Water Resources Control Board, which has the massive task of enforcing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act for regions that aren't deemed to be in compliance, along with a huge array of other duties, including overseeing drinking water issues and water rights and more. We have Jasmine Ramirez, who's a senior community development specialist with the San Joaquin Valley-based nonprofit Self-Help Enterprises, which, among many things, helps disadvantaged communities and low-income families secure water supplies. And Jasmine's focus is on SGMA to ensure that groundwater plans consider the consequences for communities. And Dusty Ferentz is the executive director of the Kings County Farm Bureau, representing the first growers to be placed under probation by state regulators who found the groundwater management plans deficient for the county's Tulare Lake groundwater basin. And then we have Aaron Fukuda, who's the general manager of the Tulare Irrigation District and interim general manager of the Mid-Cahuilla Groundwater Sustainability Agency, which is one of the agencies tasked with managing groundwater in the neighboring Cahuilla subbasin in Kings and Tulare counties. Which is also facing probation pending a hearing next year. So to start off, now that, so let's go back 10 years ago and set the scene. We're in the depths of the 2012 to 2014 drought. We've got households and even communities that are losing their water supplies. The dried out earth is sinking, which is a phenomenon known as subsidence. Jasmine, what were residents experiencing at this time 10 years ago?
I think that at this time, 10 years ago, prior to SGMA, overpumping across the San Joaquin Valley has been impacting many families and their livelihoods very deeply across the valley. And I think that was really highlighted during that drought period of 2012 to 2016, and it's still felt today as we're planning for sustainability. Prior to SGMA being passed in 2014, groundwater use was unregulated in California. There had been a couple different laws that had allowed local voluntary management of groundwater, but because it was voluntary, it was only done in certain parts of the state. It wasn't enforceable, and outcomes varied drastically. And because of the sharp increase in impacts that were highlighted during that drought period, that's really what made it politically feasible for SGMA to pass in 2014. And some of the most pressing challenges for families are not just having water available for use, but having that water be clean and non-contaminated. Having available water largely is impacted by overpumping, as the ag industry overpumps groundwater and has not been required to restrict their groundwater usage. This leads to domestic wells in rural communities going dry. And in terms of contaminated groundwater, we find that often groundwater that families rely on for their households are contaminated. And when families are quite literally forced to rely on contaminated groundwater for drinking, cooking, bathing, we've seen both long-term and short-term health problems from that exposure becoming a concern.
Dusty, things were pretty rough agriculturally at the time too. What was going on for farmers?
Yeah, really, the ag industry was no different than domestic well use. Surface water just wasn't available. The industry relied more heavily on groundwater, and you know, a lot of growers experienced similar things. Domestic and agricultural wells went dry, water levels dropped, and it became harder to produce a crop and get a crop all the way through to harvest in those years.
Yeah, I remember talking to a well driller who years later could so clearly recall the trauma of just person after person calling him for help, both households and smaller farms. And he told me the stress of knowing that folks were going to lose their farms was just overwhelming. So yeah,
Personally, we were farming then and had to drill a well ourselves. Actually, had to drill an ag well and a domestic well, and the wait time when we called our well driller that we had a long-term relationship with was I think at the time it was 14 months that we had to come up with some alternative water sources.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, looking back, we now know that as deliveries from the major reservoirs plummeted, growers had to pump more groundwater to make up the difference, caused a whole host of challenges, especially in the San Joaquin Valley. And as Jasmine said, at the time, California had the notable distinction of being the last in the West without statewide laws governing groundwater management. And so that really set the stage for, in 2014, lawmakers stepping in with SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And basically what it did was it set up local groundwater management agencies around the state, often led by agricultural interests, irrigation districts, local governments, and it gave these agencies until 2040 to reach sustainable levels of pumping in critically overdrafted basins, 2042 for ones in less dire straits. And in the meantime, these local agencies were tasked with putting plans in place and making progress to halt overuse. So, Chair Esquivel, what's the goal here for SGMA? What are California's water regulators needing to see it accomplished? Like set the stakes for us.
Yeah, I appreciate this discussion. At its most simplest, it's making sure that we're not taking more out of our groundwater systems than is going back in, reaching sustainability. But that very simple premise has a lot of complexity. When we look at the actual groundwater basins we're managing, the way different layers here over time have built up and created confined aquifers and unconfined aquifers. And so ultimately, we're looking to ensure that there are not undesirable results from that overpumping, subsidence of infrastructure, importantly, communities with wells going dry. And ultimately, we're trying to preserve this resource for the future. The reality is that the state has always gone through periods of drought where we depend upon our groundwater resources to be able to get us through dry times. But really that severity of the 2012 and 2016 drought, the depths of it, the amount of dryness, we hadn't seen. It was historic, and it was a wake-up call ultimately, because we were seeing groundwater levels drop 50 feet below historic lows, in wide swaths, and in some places up to 100 feet below historic lows. So it was really a wake-up call. Again, at its most simplest, we're here trying to ensure that we're not taking more out of the system than is actually being replenished, and ensuring that the groundwater basins are there for future generations to actually lean upon during drought times, which we know will get deeper, and here will need to be dependent upon into the future. But that simple premise is incredibly complicated and incredibly impactful to communities, and how we implement is so important. And so we're here to, especially as a regulator, the board here is a backstop. And ultimately, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is implemented with local agencies, with then state support, both between the Department of Water Resources and the state board. And we're here to help locals keep that control, but importantly, keep us on track for what is a huge lift, I well know and want to acknowledge, for so much of the leadership throughout the state here as we grapple with an existential threat to our communities and to their livelihoods into the future. I think for many of us that work in this space, it would have been great if this was settled out 30, 40, 50 years ago. But we are the last state here in the West to really grapple with this. And 10 years in now, there's a lot of good progress to be able to point to, if not still, as we know, a lot of work before us.
Yeah, I remember that this is an issue that Governor Brown worked on during his very first term, only for it to come back during a much later term, decades later, as an issue that finally led to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Dusty and Aaron, very briefly, each of you, can you tell us what sort of shockwaves the new laws sent through the agricultural community 10 years ago? What were some of the biggest fears for groundwater users in the area? Let's start with you, Aaron.
Yeah, when this law hit the ground, I mean, it for us water agencies, we always knew this was kind of lingering in the background, and many of us that are conjunctive use irrigation districts, meaning
Sorry, can you define convention?
Yeah, conjunctive use irrigation district usage is applying surface water when you have it and using groundwater when you don't have it. We could see, we were monitoring groundwater levels and watching them drop too. So I think for some of us, it was okay, we knew it was coming, and we're going to have to get to work. I think for a broader landscape that never used surface water, we call them quote unquote white areas or undistricted ground or groundwater dependent. Those folks were almost, in my experience with them, were in denial, because many thought that groundwater was a property right, and an unfettered property right under which you can pump to the extremes. And so to say that will have to be monitored and regulated was a very shocking and life-changing. And if you can imagine, that family is sitting at a dinner table with a business plan about how their future looks. That future now is going to be diminished based upon its water supply. And we're seeing that in real time right now, where landowners' land values are tanking down to half of the value of what they thought they had. So in farming, your value is in your land, right? That's your equity under which you farm under. And so if you lost half your equity within a couple of years, your future looks way different. And so it was a very shocking new regulation. However, those of us that work in this field know that communication, reaching out, talking with the growers, you can start to bring them under the umbrella and understand the concepts. And our goal now is to minimize the amount of ag ground we lose, because if you look at our communities, we aren't burgeoning Google campuses. We are formulated under the ag umbrella, from our businesses to our restaurants to our shopping. So we know we need to minimize that loss of ag.
And Dusty, really quickly, what about for growers kind of on the ground? How did the news of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act affect them?
Yeah, Aaron did a really good job summing up what happened from a grower's perspective. Aaron deals with growers as much as I do. The only thing I think that I would add to that is the feeling of unknown and the dread that comes with unknown. Change is hard for everybody, and what we've experienced under Sigma, and we talk about a lot, is there's these milestones and these important dates that are important to the law and are necessary to get us to achieving sustainability. But the amount of time that comes between those and what happens as a result of this milestone date happening is a scenario of hurry up and wait, right? Do all this work, achieve this, reach this milestone deadline, and then there's this period of unknown again and what's coming. And the uncertainty is stressful, to say the very least.
That's something I want to discuss, because one concern I've heard throughout my reporting is about the very long lead time for Sigma that gives local agencies and growers 26 years or more to actually rein in depletion since the passage of the law. And now, we're 10 years in. I'm hoping we can quickly go around and talk about what we're seeing. Jasmine, at the community level, is Sigma doing anything yet to relieve some of the issues it was intended to 10 years ago? I know that last time we talked, even with kind of the inundations of 2023 and 2024, wells were still going dry in the San Joaquin Valley.
And it is definitely a long process that we are seeing. The impacts of overpumping coupled with increasing climate change has left disadvantaged communities really at the forefront of the devastating impacts, and can completely relate to the conversations about uncertainty, because I feel like that is something that many people who are impacted by Sigma are feeling. The fear of the unknown, fear of not being able to count on a water supply. Similarly, over 2,000 wells have gone dry in California over the last 3 years. If you average that out, that's about 2 families or households a day that have been losing water. And we see thousands of residents with no option but to rely on bottled water. And Sigma really provides us with the opportunity to work together to grow and ensure the livelihood of all Valley communities. And we've seen, especially so over the last few years, some GSAs being able to implement projects that are beneficial for surrounding communities, specifically with benefits, direct benefits for surrounding disadvantaged communities. And it's our hope that not only are these projects continue to be developed, but relationships are continued to be built. Yeah.
So I remember seeing some studies come out a few years ago. I think they only looked through 2022, but they did they looked at changes, especially in kind of key agricultural areas, and including decisions to drill wells, changes in crops, and found really sort of limited changes to that point. Wells were still going in. Hundreds have gone in just in the last, I think, the year and a half between 2022 and 2020, the end of 2023. So I'm wondering, Aaron and Dusty, what are you seeing from major groundwater users 10 years into Sigma? Are folks actually starting to change the decisions about what they plant, whether they drill, now that we're 10 years in? Dusty, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, there definitely are changes being made. If I could take an opportunity and go back to the comment about 26 years and 10 years of Sigma, I think it's really important to point out that, we didn't get to the point where we needed to implement Sigma or we needed to pass the law in 10 years or 20 years. It's a multiple decades long process. And it's very complex and very complicated to achieve sustainability. So in the grand scheme of things, this first 10-year period isn't really that much time. To answer your questions about changes and the number of wells being drilled and things like that, it'd be really interesting to see how many of those wells drilled in that time period that you mentioned were replacement wells versus new, completely new wells. And it's also, it takes time to make changes in agriculture. When you plant a tree crop, for example, you're a year and a half to 2 years in ground preparation and irrigation installs before you can plant your trees, and then you're 4 to 8 years before your trees have grown enough to be to produce a crop. So you're looking at 10 years before you're generating any revenue off of this investment. So changes to cropping take time when you've got that length of time and that financial investment before you're starting to see a return. But certainly in the last couple of years, we are seeing changes. It's evident right now. I don't have stats, but it's evident right now when you traverse Kings and Tulare counties. Walnuts, for example, are being pulled out by the hundreds of acres, if not thousands of acres at this point. New crops are being tried in our area. Hemp was grown in Kings County, industrial and hemp for CBD was grown in Kings County several years ago. Part of the appeal there was that it was estimated to take far less water to set a crop. In Kings County and in Fresno counties, agave is being planted for the same thing. The water demand is low. We're not growing alfalfa like we used to grow here in the Central Valley because of its water demand. So we are certainly seeing changes. They just don't happen overnight in our industry.
Aaron, do you have anything to add?
I think it's often hard to put all of this into context. It is tremendous. If I were to write a book, you'd never finish it. And I think
Like most water books.
Yeah.
They tend to be lengthy.
Let me go get started. I think chapter 1 would be to understand that we started Sigma in a drought. Well, we drafted Sigma in a drought, said form under a drought, and then we started implementation. So we submitted our plans in 2020, had to begin implementation. So we began implementation and trying to solve the problem at the front end of a drought. So those two things are really complicated. And I think the other complex part about it is the decisions on the planting, like Dusty had pointed out, and the wells are so intertwined into many different things. For instance, you make a decision to plant years ahead of when you actually plant because you have to order the plants, right? So that decision was made in a period where commodity prices across the board were double or triple where they were at today. So that we had an infusion of people coming into agriculture, and now the atmosphere is we have an exodus of agriculture. So there's a dramatic change in my mind because of the atmosphere under which agriculture is now under, the regulatory, the resource supply. We are seeing in our region, like Dusty pointed out, our walnut industry is gone. If they're not coming out today, they're coming out tomorrow. Almonds are slowly reducing. That market has disappeared. Pistachios is still holding, but we see some cracks in that too. And
these are the result of market changes, though, more than groundwater regulation.
It's all
right?
intertwined. It's all one thing. And the water market, the water industry causes pressure on the pricing, and the availability it's all intertwined. It's one ball. And we often work, we are here to solve the 6 undesirable results under Sigma: subsidence, groundwater levels, groundwater quality, and these things. But as GSA managers, we know
Groundwater Sustainability Agency, the local agencies that have sprung up to implement Sigma in their areas.
And we have to solve these 6 issues, these 6 impacts. But as a GSA, Groundwater Sustainability Agency manager, what we're doing is we know that we have to balance the impacts of Sigma. And so what I want to say, the change that we're seeing is the small grower, the medium grower, the family grower, they're putting the for sale signs up. They're leaving, they're gone. We're seeing land fallowed, and we're seeing the stressors starting to enter the communities, right? So less buying, less of everything. And that has a lot to do with just general economy and inflation and things. So in our region, what we've implemented is a groundwater allocation system with a cutback, meaning we allocate less groundwater than they need to grow the average crop in our area. We have a water marketing strategy that's been propped up, and the funds that we're collecting for all of this prop up a mitigation program that our growers have said, okay, if a community member loses their well, we'll go re-drill that well. Well, our mitigation fund in our subbasin alone is $5.8 million a year. So out of our growers' pockets, there's $5.8 million missing this year because we're going and it's agreed upon, and we think this is the right way to do it, is to cover those that are most susceptible, which are our domestic wells, if we're allowed to continue to farm. It's just the price of that farming is taking the small, medium grower and making it impossible for them to have a future. So we're seeing them leave.
So what I'm hearing is also it takes a long time to kind of turn this ship, but at the same time, there are immediate impacts of groundwater depletion on household wells, on subsidence, on infrastructure. You know, we're seeing roads and canals crack and billions of dollars of repairs. So Chair Esquivel, is enough happening, and is it happening fast enough under Sigma to protect the state's groundwater?
Yeah, I think I'll start with over the course of the last 10 years, what have we really seen improved? And there's a lot more data. We know a lot more about our groundwater basins than we did 10 years ago. I think we have to recall back in, again, the 2012, 2016 drought, how flat-footed I think a lot of our local and state agencies were really found with even just understanding how much overpumping was necessarily happening and even responding to communities that were going dry. We didn't have the programs that we had in this last turn of the drought established yet. So, you know, famously, we recall East Porterville and the number of dry wells that went there, and the emergency fashion in which we had to quickly try to scramble, and ultimately, you know, saw over 2,600 wells go dry in that period without comprehensive programs, either at the local or state level, to be able to support what we saw. So the other improvement, you know, beyond the data and the coordination that's been happening, is responsiveness to communities, where in the last 3 years, the State Water Board has actually funded to the tune of 164 million responses to dry wells. That's hauled and bottled water, that's technical assistance, that's helping systems that went dry. And those were all responses that we didn't have 2012 to 2016. But I think the reality is, though, that for many, we thought there was popular thinking out there, the 2012 to 2016 drought was a once in a generation drought, a historic drought that we wouldn't necessarily see again so quickly. And then we did. We saw a repeat of drought conditions. And so I think what, you know, this shows is while, you know, for sure, 2040 is the current timeline in the law, you know, as sub-basins are before the board and probationary process, which I know we'll get to in a moment. We're not trying to judge them to their 2040 standards. It's really at this point around their groundwater sustainability plans and what's happening. But I can't help, I think a lot of us share this, a sense of urgency because we've seen how quickly we get back into drought conditions now. We know with climate change, these will get deeper. And the question is, do we have the luxury of the many years in order to get a handle on this, or do we need to see a little more urgency? So again, I acknowledge that there's been a tremendous amount of work. That the fact that the Groundwater Sustainability Agency is formed and we're hitting these milestones is important unto itself. And there's still work to do.
Yeah. So after waiting in the wings for a lot of the past 10 years, it's now time for your agency, the State Water Resources Control Board, to step in, right, and start intervening. And staff have found a number of plans, especially for parts of the San Joaquin Valley, really wanting. And so I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what the major concerns have been.
Yeah, I think quickly I'll gloss just on the process and kind of where we are. Again, importantly, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is implemented by locals, the Department of Water Resources, and ourselves. And the first, goal was here to get those groundwater sustainability agencies established. That was a moment where if any of the basins hadn't established the GSA, had coverage, they would be referred to the board. But we got through that process, and now it's been work on groundwater sustainability plans here. You know, how do we connect the dots to 2040? How do we see that there is a plan in place in order to begin to arrest the overdraft, to be able to start to mediate these undesirable results in the basins? And the Department of Water Resources was evaluating those. And importantly, the Department of Water Resources really gave a lot of flexibility. Created a step here where they provided an incomplete status to the applicants. So GSAs were able to go back, try to work on them further before they were evaluated for adequacy. And then the Department of Water Resources in March of 2023 found 6 of those basins inadequate. So those 6 basins are here before the board. And over the last year and a half, we've been working with those basins, trying to be communicative and going through a probationary process. Unfortunately, the word of probation, I think, really it has a negative connotation. But here it means that the board, if a basin is brought to probation, we'll have to assess fees because that's part of the law. We have to recoup our program. That's not something the board itself decided to do. And we can ask for additional information. It's not what ultimately I think a lot of concern out there is for is an interim plan that forces down some actions to the basin that they otherwise are not looking to have. And so the board here, as we're evaluating those GSPs, is really trying to say,
groundwater sustainability plans.
groundwater sustainability plans, is really just trying to best understand technically, is the document sound, and importantly, can we all collectively connect those dots to sustainability in 2040, or are there some additional corrections or approaches that need to be taken within the plan in order for us to have confidence that yes, the plan is one that can be a successful one, and here transfer folks back over to DWR and continue to implement. I will note as well on flexibility and working with basins, the board also additionally added another step here insofar as allowing for the resubmittal of these groundwater sustainability plans, even as we're kind of going through a probationary process. And that is, again, a sign from us that we're really looking to work with regions and the groundwater sustainability agencies, the subbasins here, and be able to focus on what the real problem here is, which is the overdraft, which is climate change and all these pressures, and keep us all collectively focused on these outcomes that we as a state have acknowledged we need to move toward and are working with locals to do so.
So as you said, the axe that's sort of hanging over the head of these local groundwater agencies is the state possibility of the state stepping in and taking over. The first step along the way is probation. As alarming as that sounds, I'm wondering, Dusty, so your groundwater basin, the Tulare Lake Basin in Kings County, is the first in a truly kind of unprecedented move by state water regulators, is the first now to be facing probation. I understand that there is a lawsuit going on that has kind of pressed pause on the implementation of probation in the Tulare Lake subbasin. We won't get into the weeds of the litigation, which is going to be argued in court. We definitely don't have enough time to get into the weeds here. But Dusty, I'm wondering why probation is so concerning. What are the impacts for folks in the basin?
Well, the impacts over probation can be tremendous. I mean, in the short term, there are additional fees and requirements that would be placed on groundwater pumpers, and that's, these questions are difficult to answer because of the status of the litigation, and we have published some information on that. If people want to seek that out on their own, they can read more about our positions. But there's always a financial impact. There's the overall consideration of the plan that seems to work for locals, and that local professionals and water users, think will achieve sustainability. And then, of course, there's the concern of an interim plan implemented by the state board, because their options are limited, and that's not a slight at the state board. It's just the fact of the matter is their options to achieve sustainability through an interim plan are much more limited than what locals have here. And unfortunately, those limitations will have tremendous implications on the local agriculture and our economy. In the Tulare Lake Subbasin, which makes up approximately 2/3 of Kings County, our only economic driver is the agriculture industry. In 2020, we were directly responsible for 25% of the available jobs in the county, only beaten by local governments as far as the number of jobs created. But you kind of have to set that aside, because without an industry to pay taxes to fund local governments can't employ people. And And in Kings County, there isn't an oil and gas industry. There's not a manufacturing industry. There's not a tourism industry. We're a deep valley, mostly west side county that exists because agriculture is able to thrive here. And if we don't carefully implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, we risk losing all of that for the entire county. And that's why we're challenging things so hardly. That's why we're working so diligently to achieve sustainability, to comply with the law, but do so in a way and at a pace that doesn't decimate an industry, which would ultimately turn the county into a ghost town.
I remember reading in the staff report that the staff analysis found that the current plan would, and I'm quoting now, allow substantial impacts to people who rely on domestic wells for drinking, bathing, food preparation, and cleaning, as well as impacts to critical infrastructure such as canals, levees, and the aquifer itself. And I remember that the Tulare Lake subbasin was kind of in a interesting predicament when it came up for its probation hearing, in that it hadn't yet resubmitted a revised plan to address those issues. And in your basin, you have a lot of varied growers, right? There are the kind of the smaller family growers, and then there are major corporate growers as well, including J.G. Boswell Company. And I was wondering what that, I remember hearing some tension about the kind of very different agricultural enterprises in the basin. And I'm wondering how that tension played out and factored into the challenges of resubmitting the plan and, trying to avoid probation in that way.
Well, the issues that arose and that needed to be worked out through that were much more complex and complicated than large versus small, north versus south, or GSA versus GSA. Across the board, there were concerns with plans and how they were going to be implemented and how much they were going to cost growers and what those overall impacts were going to be, not only to the growers and landowners themselves, but to the job market and to the economy. We could fill an entire afternoon talking about the intricacies of and the disagreements and the difficulties of working that out. But what I will say
to
is,
Aaron's water book.
exactly, we could write a whole nother book. But there's been changes in leadership in the subbasin. There's been a different willingness to work together, even though that working together looks differently than it did a year ago or 2 years ago. I'm confident and hopeful that we can get these challenges worked out.
So, Aaron, your basin is also facing probation with a hearing next year with very similar issues flagged by water board staff, including effects on groundwater wells and also effects of subsidence with the earth sinking and potentially damaging major infrastructure, including the staff report flags the Frank Kern Canal. And I'm wondering what your plans are for trying to avoid being in the same situation that the Tulare Lake subbasin is in.
Yeah, we view it a little, from a lens of a subbasin that's working hard to get sustainability. So we are here because our groundwater sustainability plan is inadequate and we need to fix things. But we see this through the lens of actually putting the programs and policies in place that we know we need to get to sustainability. That's implementation. In 2020, we realized that we needed to change our approach, and that coincided with the submission of our old plan. So we submitted a plan and we realized, well, that's not going to work. We need to change. We made that change on the ground, and now we're reflecting that in our document. And I tell people, when you're a kid and you're being walked to the principal's office and you're scared and you don't know, and Joaquin's our principal, but what I feel that the person in front of us leading us to the principal's office, the state board staff, is helping us navigate the hallways, make sure we make the right turns. And we're hopeful that we can avoid that probation and keep that implementation moving forward, because we really think we can get to sustainability actually on a faster, we worry about the 26 years. I've advocated for, Sigma has said you need to solve sustainability in 40 years or 20 years. And I tell people you need to solve it in 4. because due to climate change and other things that are happening, you're going to get 4 wet cycles. And Sigma is not about groundwater. Sigma is about surface water and how much you're putting back in your system so that you can take out. Chairman Esquivel explained that elegantly. That's what we're doing, is trying to figure out how we can put enough back in so that we can take out, so we have a future there. So we're hopeful to avoid that probationary process, keep on our implementation process, achieve that sustainability. But again, I feel that we're being led to that path and we're following that right now. But Dusty pointed out the risks are, I can't even use the word tremendous. They're almost insurmountable if we do in our region, if we end up in probation, because we have so much of that going forward. Our growers have told us, Aaron, you and your agency have led us down this path. We believe in it, but if we're told that we're going down a different path, and it's Chairman Esquivel and his team only have one surgical knob to turn, and that's demand management. So they're going to crank it down to get to sustainability, and probably in a very fast fashion, that our folks are going to say, well, we can only do one, we're only going to follow one path, and your programs are out, and if we're under an interim plan, that's in, and that's pretty much going to be a stop for us as far as groundwater sustainability under local control. And I don't know if we can gain that momentum back, but I think both the state board, their staff, and us, we all recognize that it's not misunderstood. It's all recognized up front. That's why we're working so hard to stay out of probation.
Jasmine, something that we've been hearing a lot about is time, whether there's enough time to make these changes, whether it's taking too long for communities. What do you think? One of the critiques I've heard about the probation process is that it is lengthy. And in the meantime, wells are still going dry. How long this has taken? How is that affecting communities and households with precarious water supplies?
I too have heard much critique about the long process of the probationary period. However, ultimately, we do feel that taking time to make sure that things are done for the best interest of residents, particularly if it means taking more time to do that, then that is something that we support. Ultimately, we take a collaborative approach to this process, and we work with both DWR and State Water Board staff, as well as the Groundwater Sustainability agencies, as the probationary hearing process is underway. And as groundwater sustainability agencies are developing their groundwater sustainability plans, our work really involves engaging with all sides of the spectrum while we focus on the needs of disadvantaged communities being amplified in those plans, as they are traditionally excluded from policy decision-making processes, not only in the world of water, but in many policy decision-making processes overall. As an organization, we really aim to highlight the vulnerabilities that we see in proposed plans, and to offer recommendations and alternative approaches for how plans can be improved to be more reflective of resident needs, particularly those within disadvantaged communities, many of which in the San Joaquin Valley are 100% reliant on groundwater for drinking water consumption in their households. And as a team here at Self Help, we are tracking 2 of the subbasins that are slated for probationary hearings, those being the Tule subbasin and the Kuya subbasin. And we aim to be transparent with both the groundwater sustainability agencies and the State Water Board in the comments that we provide for plans. Some of these are organizational comments on how plans could be improved to be more protective of folks, and other comments, for example, are pulled together comments from residents directly within the subbasin, sharing their experiences with their drinking water and their concerns that they have. And we provide these recommendations both to groundwater sustainability agencies, but also to the State Water Board for their consideration. And so overall, I think that if it means taking more time to get it right, I think that the risks are so high. And I'm not sure that we have, like Chair Escobar was saying, the luxury of waiting until 2040. But when it comes to the probationary process itself, I think that ultimately we trust the judgment of the State Water Board staff experts who have laid out this timeline. And in providing our comments from a neutral standpoint and being transparent with those comments, reflecting the concerns for the needs of residents that we have, we trust the State Water Board staff experts to make appropriate recommendations for whether a subbasin should or should not be placed on probation.
So zooming out a little, one of the issues we've talked about is a demand for groundwater and managing that demand going forward. And I threw out some numbers. I found the exact stats. Even in the recent drought, 369 new or modified irrigation wells went in Tulare County, 289 in Fresno, 105 in Kern, 99 in Kings. Chair Escobar, can groundwater overdraft really be curbed if there continues to be more groundwater pumping going on?
Yeah, it's all in the numbers. And I think that that's, again, where at least, now into this, we have a lot greater handle on what is being over extracted. And you could very well have new wells and still be within, your path to sustainability, perhaps, or really not exceeding what we call in the law minimum thresholds in the basin. But it becomes harder. It does put on more demand on the resource. So again, at this point, I think you see a lot of discussion certainly happening around, how do we get a handle on what is coming online, how important and important to necessarily here really balance these decisions. And I acknowledge that our communities here are incredibly dependent on agriculture. I come from a background here where my grandparents worked in fields. We were dependent upon agriculture here for the opportunities that led to my own path here at the state board, and know that it is incredibly consequential. But here, the threat is not having that resource here at all into the future. And I think that it's really trying to best balance that existential threat with the harm that does come from the economic losses in right sizing our demands from the basin. So to your question, again, you could put in new wells and still be okay, but it's really around the numbers and how you're managing your system.
So we have time, I think, for maybe two more questions.
Rachel, can I weigh on that really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have that direct connect. We receive all well permits in our region from the county. And so just to put that number in context, I don't know of any new well. They were replacement wells for something that went dry. So that number is a little deceiving. And not only that, we are re-drilling wells to avoid subsidence. So we're getting out of the lower aquifer, coming up to the upper aquifer. So I want to be careful not to say a new well means new agricultural production. It's a replacement of an old well. And what we're also finding in our domestic wells that are going dry, not all of them are going dry because of groundwater levels. They're just old. I personally lost my own well because my casing went bad, not because the groundwater level dropped. So hidden in these numbers are, it's like you said at the opening, it's everything we can't see. So it's really complicated.
Thank you, Aaron. So quickly, Aaron and Dusty, question for you, and then one more for Chair Escobar, and then we'll go to audience questions. Groundwater has long been the pressure release valve when surface water supplies dry up. You both have talked about that. What do you see as the bigger threat to agriculture and the agricultural communities, groundwater depletion or groundwater regulation?
Can I change that up a little bit? I think
Go
it's
for it.
surface water availability. Like I said,
That's going to decrease substantially going forward with climate change.
Yep. Well, there's multiple things pressuring that. There's climate change, there's regulatory programs, but yes, because we're not, again, if your equation is you only get to take out what you put in, we're putting in surface water. We're not putting in groundwater, we're putting in surface water. So to me, it's surface water that's going to cause the pressure, the pinch point for us in the future. We are all rushing to put in recharge basins and use the aquifer as a reservoir. The problem is you have to have the resource to put in the reservoir. So to me, it's the pressure point surface water.
Chair Esquivel, how are state regulators going to balance these dual threats and getting that balance right?
Yeah, it's definitely a balance. And I think there was a time where, you had drought policy during drought time and then flood policy shift when, flood times came. And now, especially these last years, the dramatic swings that we're seeing, we really have to think of the system as a whole. And so to Aaron's point, it is important to make sure we're understanding in those wet years how we're allowing folks to be able to get water into the ground. And importantly, keep an eye on water quality as well. I think, these are incredibly complex systems. And here on the State Water Board side, prior to this was back going to 2017, 2018, we actually developed temporary water rights for groundwater recharge, knowing that getting a full water right can be a lot. You get, a lot of folks protesting, oftentimes people competing for the same drops in a watershed. And so being able to have a more nimbler tool within the water rights system to be able to allow for the capture and recharge of water was important. And, that came to good effect in 2023 here, our banner year, where the state board was able to authorize 1.2 million acre feet of recharge on the water rights side. And then also here we developed tools around time when there's a lot of excess high floods happening within the watersheds to be able to pull some of that off, use it for recharge, but not get the full benefit, if you will, if it were in fact gone through the water rights system, but at least helping it accrue to the groundwater basins. So we've been doing our part to try to make sure that we're listening here and importantly providing tools that help us facilitate that recharge that we know is important in those wet years, and also to keep an eye on quality. There are certain places where it's not appropriate sometimes to recharge because you'll actually can worsen water quality issues that many communities are facing already. And so, we're to your point, it's a balancing these competing needs and ultimately trying to do our best to adjust to a system where, this water year alone as well, not sure where we'll necessarily be headed and have to be prepared to be able to pivot both to response in drought and or also being able to take advantage of wet periods.
All right, I think we have time for a few audience questions. Evelyn, did you want to read the first one?
Yes, thank you. This question is from Annabelle. She asks, what can people who rely on well water in Madera expect in the coming years regarding drought? And where can they go to find out the depth and health of their domestic wells?
That sounds like a question for both Jasmine and Chair Esquivel. Who wants to take a stab at it?
I'll say, I know, well, one, I appreciate the question, and I know there are many households similarly out there really kind of wondering, what's happening. First, one of your best sources of information is your local groundwater sustainability agency. I encourage folks to get involved, to understand what those groundwater sustainability plans are looking at. What are the thresholds that are being incorporated into those plans. And when it comes to understanding where groundwater levels are, the Department of Water Resources has a great resource. It's a groundwater live platform that I think it's Groundwater Now. I apologize for not having the website here right off mine, but is a great tool to be able to see, okay, where are groundwater levels? When it comes to groundwater quality, the State Water Resources Control Board has our Groundwater Ambient Monitoring Assessment Program, GAMA. There too are maps of the known water quality issues and water quality in areas, so you can kind of see in your area with various monitoring wells what the quality of water is like as well. But I do encourage folks to connect to their groundwater sustainability agencies who can also help guide them and are there to be the point for communities and others as we go through the implementation of this law.
Our next question is about the future of farmland, and it's asking how economically feasible is converting fallowed farmland to solar electricity production? How do the costs of such production in the Central Valley compare with other sources of renewable energy, electricity? Dusty and Aaron, this one sounds like a question for you too.
Yeah, solar we talk about a lot right now, and at least here in Kings County, we're running into a capacity issue. The grid and the substations in the county are at about max capacity, or they have plans for new projects that will max out their capacity. Technologies are changing around batteries and battery storage, and that may increase the ability, but that as an option for converting farmland into solar is just about tapped out, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, we're in the same boat. We've looked at it, and it's the capacity to transmit. And then when you engage with the power utilities, it's difficult, to say the least. And there has to be profit in it for everybody, it seems like, in that industry. So as you start traipsing down the line, is it even really beneficial? We get down to the dollars, and it never pencils out. So we've not yet indoctrinated the conversion of fallow to solar, but what we have adopted is a multi-benefit land repurposing project. So we're converting properties into habitat spaces, public access spaces, and it has a combination recharge. We're developing a park soccer complex for the city of Visalia that'll have a recharge component. It's a 300-acre site, so it'll have some public benefit to it. So they call them multi-benefit land repurposing projects, and we really see a good value there.
Fascinating. What a good question and great answers. Thanks all. Do we have time for one more?
Yes, I think we can do one last one.
Great.
This one says, given that many large farmers and water companies are drilling more and more deeper wells due to Sigma, what is being accomplished to close these and other loopholes? With deeper wells and withdrawal of more underground water, how are smaller farmers doing under Sigma?
I'll just answer for my region. We're actually not, I mean, we were drilling deeper during the drought because we were going down, but as Chairman Esquivel pointed out, the amount of data and knowledge that we've learned about our aquifer system in the last 10 years, probably we hadn't even accumulated that amount of information in the last 50 years. And so our actions are actually now to try and start drilling shallower wells and start recharging in the upper aquifer and stay in that upper aquifer. So it's a new dynamic, another change for our growers, one that we haven't fully vetted out yet, but we're working on. It's an arc. Remember, we're only in chapter 2 that I've only written so far, so I got a million more chapters to write. So all I can say is stay tuned. Don't assume that drilling deeper is the way the future is. Also, don't assume that drilling deeper is the bad thing either. Let us work it out. There's a lot of things we assume in groundwater. They've all been incorrect. So put it that way.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over now to our editor-in-chief, Kristen, to wrap up.
Rachel, thank you for putting together this great panel. And I want to say thank you to Jasmine, Dusty, Aaron, and Chair Esquivel. We're getting a book out of this, and we're getting a whole nother afternoon as I was listening to this conversation. Thank you also to everybody who joined us for this past hour. This was a really great conversation, and I also really love the really smart questions from our audience. At CalMatters, we want to make sure that we engage Californians in the issues that really matter, and so this was a perfect example of that. So thank you all for your time. We are a nonprofit news organization. We provide our stories for free to 280 news organizations across the state. So if you enjoyed the time here, we ask you to please sign up for our newsletter. And if you are so inclined, also, we're a nonprofit, so we take donations as well. Thank you so much for this hour. Really great questions, really great conversation. Appreciate your time.